Hey guys, my name is Caitlin and I'm here to talk to you guys about sexuality stuff and boundaries. It's gonna be awesome. Okay, so here's the first part that I just want you to kind of think about. Why would your student ever feel safe or feel comfortable talking to you about sexuality? What have you done to make this topic safe? That's like a big question to ask, and you can even actually ask your student, like, hey, do you feel safe talking to me about this? And then they'll say yes or no, and then you can ask why. And that could help a lot. One of the things I tell parents is this is an area, sexuality is an area where students have very little biblical knowledge, but they're super interested. So there's a high interest and low biblical knowledge. And that means that when you have these conversations with them, even though they may look like they have a glazed over look on their face, like, I'm out, they're actually hungry for information. And so the more of these conversations you have in different settings and different styles, the more likely a truth is gonna really hit home and hit them to the core, and they'll be able to stand firm in that later. Students are at the beginning of their stories, right? You guys have walked your story out for quite a ways, and students are at the beginning of their stories and they don't know what the chapters ahead lead to. And puberty is a huge thing that they're going through, and everything is confusing and nothing makes sense. And so as you come alongside them in your own story, by sharing your own story with them, you give them permission to start to look at their story and start to make connections of like, oh, I am in a really hard season of life. Like, oh, maybe I do need to ask for help in this area. But it takes you being vulnerable first to model that. And then eventually students will be able to meet you and match you with your vulnerability. You have a couple options for how you can share your story with your student. If your student is older, like high school, maybe you just like lay it out there and share your whole story with them. The good, the bad, the ugly, the moments where God stepped in and intervened and helped you out. Just share all of it, because that's going to give them traction for one, seeing that you're human and that you've made mistakes. And then two, just invite them to start looking at their own story and what the next chapters, what they want in the next chapters, right, for themselves. The other thing you can do if your student's younger, maybe middle school or before that, is you can just share relevant pieces of your story. So like, what was your first dating relationship like? Was it like a 6th grade thing where you ignored each other in the hallways and everyone felt stupid and then you broke up later? Like, what was it like? And just inviting them into those funny, comical, silly beginnings of figuring out growing up moments for you gives them permission to then come alongside or step in and talk to you about it. Okay, so here are a couple things not to do. Don't assume that the second you share super vulnerably that your student will do the same, because they're not going to do it. They're probably first just going to get hit with your vulnerability and be like, oh. And then later on, they're going to be able to see like, oh, this is a safe place to talk about this. The second thing is, don't give up. Like, your students are going to need to hear you show up in this area of their life of sexuality all the time for it to click and get stuck on them. All the truths that you share with them, it's going to have to be shared over a variety of ways and in different formats for them to really understand it. One thing I tell parents is it's kind of like you're putting a quarter in a piggy bank. So you're making an investment every time you have a crucial conversation about sexuality, about relationships, about growing up. So every time you invest a quarter, do you see the next day a huge increase in your investment? No. So it might be in 3 or 4 years before you see hey, all this work you put in the front end of talking to your kid about sexuality and relationships now will pay off later when they're like, oh, I need advice. I should go talk to my parents because they know what they're talking about, right? But you have to model that. You have to say hey, there were moments where I needed to ask for help, and this is who showed up and helped me. So we're talking boundaries, the good stuff, right? All right, parents, here's the deal. You have to approach this subject before your kids are in relationships. And you might be asking, why? Well, hey, they don't know once they're in a relationship that they're gonna wanna do more things than what they wanted before they were in a relationship, right? So you have to help them build those fences up, those walls up, those guardrails to protect them from driving off a cliff before they enter into the relationship, before hormones are part of it, before they're really attracted to someone. And it's just really important. And I always suggest that you and your student sit down and you figure out what their boundaries are. It's not about you picking boundaries. It's about you coaching them through picking their boundaries, right? And then write it out. Put it on a postcard, an index card, whatever it is. Stick it somewhere where you and them will see it frequently, because it's a constant reminder of what lifestyle they want to be living and what choices they want to be making. So it's kind of like putting classroom rules up. If they see it every day, it starts to sink in, right? So boundaries, there's 3 categories: time, talk, and touch. So time is the first one. How much time are they going to spend with the person they're dating? right? Like, is it all day, every day? Probably not. What kind of time is it? Is it one-on-one time? Is it in public only? Can it be at a house when there's no parents home? You guys need to set those boundaries now. The other piece of it is what time in the day, as in, like, is it late at night when your student might be tired and let their guard down? Like, this is something to just talk through your students and help them start to realize, like, they get to make choices to help prevent them from driving their life off a cliff in this area. The second one is talk. How much are they talking to this person? Is it nonstop? Are they nonstop texting and direct messaging and Snapchatting? Are they building an emotional bond that's way beyond where they should because they're constantly talking with this person? The other thing is, should your student be sharing really intimate things with their boyfriend or girlfriend of 2 weeks? Probably not. But how would they ever know that if you don't step up and kind of walk this out? Tell them what's appropriate. If they're in middle school and they're dating someone, tell them what's appropriate conversation to be having. If they're in high school and they're dating someone, when things get serious, like, you get to coach them through this. The other fun fact is students get emotionally attached if they're constantly talking with someone. And so that's just something to remind them of, like, hey, like, how do you feel when they don't respond? When the person they're dating doesn't respond right away? Like, maybe step back a couple steps and figure out why and pinpoint, are they getting their value and their worth from that person? That's a big thing. All right, the last category is touch, which is the spicy one, right? So we're going to talk about touch boundaries. You have to help them set these boundaries before they get into a relationship, because hormones are real and they are strong and chemicals are released, and then it's hard for them to stop, right? So this is a huge thing to talk to your students about. One thing that you might get a question from your kid in is, how far is too far? And so if your student is asking this question, I think they've really already missed God's purpose for sex, right? And so maybe circle the horses back around to, like, well, why did God create this? So then how do we decide how far is too far? One thing I tell students when they ask me that question is, if they're in a dating relationship currently, will they be able to stand at the person they're dating's wedding in 3 or 5 or 10 years, whatever it is, and be the best man or the maid of honor at that person's wedding and not feel guilty or ashamed? And if they say, yeah, of course, I can totally do that, then that means they're living out their relationship in a God-honoring way that's not taking from that person, but instead is investing as a good friend in relationship and building the relationship as a whole instead of just only on physical things. So when you're talking about boundaries with your kids, you also kind of have to tackle God's purpose for sex, right? Because why do you need boundaries if you don't know the purpose? So this is how I explain God's purpose for sex to middle school students. I explain that in the Bible, there's verses that say 2 become 1. So, like, when a man leaves his wife and when a husband leaves his family and marries his wife, 2 become 1. It's glue. Sex is the glue in a marriage. So 2 become 1, and the reason God designed sex to be inside of marriage is a marriage is a forever commitment, right? So the chances of them breaking up diminish greatly because it's the forever commitment. So when students use sex outside of marriage, they're gluing themselves to people that they're going to then break up with. And when you take 2 pieces of construction paper and you glue it together, and then 20 minutes later, you're like, oh, I put that piece in the wrong spot, and you rip it apart, what happens? You lose pieces of each color to each other piece. So we lose pieces of ourselves because we bonded ourselves to someone outside of the covenant marriage, and then when we break up, the bond takes pieces of us, and we get pieces of that person. So that's how I explain what sex is to middle schoolers. And the idea is we have to build up guardrails in our lives. Boundaries are the guardrails that keep us from driving off a cliff. So one of the things I explained in the student sexuality series this year is I showed a picture of, like, a super windy mountain road with no guardrails. And then I showed them one with guardrails. And I was like, when do you think the guardrails were put up? And some students said before someone crashed, and some said after. And I think the beautiful part about grace and the gospel is the guardrails can be put up at any time. So it's never too late to help your students set up boundaries to protect them, to keep them safe, to keep them from bringing baggage into their future marriage. And or you can build them before they get into relationships, right? So wherever your student is at and wherever you are at in talking to your students about sexuality, it's never too late to help them build boundaries, to remind them that grace is real and that when they mess up, God's there to pick them up. The last thing I want to talk to you guys about, besides boundaries, is this sexuality thing is going to be a long road for your student to walk out. And so the more times you show up, the more times you invest, the more creative ways you decide to like take your student out to talk about this topic, it's going to be the best investment that you can do in your students' lives. Because the thing I explained to students this year in our sexuality series is sexuality is a central feature to being human, and it's deeply individualized. And sexuality consists of our thoughts, our feelings, attractions, and sometimes behavior. So really, nothing your student is feeling or going through is wrong, but they need to be reminded that, right? Like, they're growing up and things are hard to understand and their body is changing in crazy ways, but they think that they're wrong when they don't really know what's going on. So remind them that their sexuality is individual, like they're going to be going through things that their friends might not be going through. And feelings, thoughts, and attractions, that's not a bad thing. If your kid has a crush on someone, tell them that's fine. Like, that's okay. Like, God created us to be attracted to people. That's how relationships happen, right? But students don't know it's okay. I would say, like, I got 30 questions this year from students writing on index cards when we took an offering of questions about sexuality, saying, like, is it okay if I have a crush on someone? Yes! But what breaks my heart is they don't feel safe enough to ask their parents that, right? So initiate those conversations. And just remind them that grace is for this area, right? Grace shows up when we mess up. And that's a huge deal and a huge thing to remind them of. And when you find out that they mess up, to have grace be a huge part of that too, because you're modeling the gospel. All right, so we're going to talk about consent. This is a super important conversation to be having. You need to have it whether you have a daughter or a son, whatever it is, you need to be having this conversation. What is consent? Consent is asking before you make any physical movements forward. So whether that's a hug, whether that's a kiss, whether that's more things, you ask first, you listen to their response, and if they say no, then you say, okay, and you keep being a friend to that person. If they say yes, then you take that step together. But consent is one of those things where when we choose not to teach our students about it, we're setting them up for failure in the future. And we're playing deeper into this culture that we have with issues of sexual assault when we don't choose to tell our students, like, hey, this is appropriate behavior and this is inappropriate behavior. They're not set up for success, right? There's this rad video called Consent is Tea, and it just explains simply like what consent looks like. And it's easy for students to grasp, so I would encourage you to watch that with your student. The other thing I want to remind you of is when you model safe touch in your family, you're modeling consent for future romantic relationships and just for people in general. So like if you go up and give your student a hug, do you ask first? If you start to ask before you give them a hug, you give them the opportunity to learn how to find their voice and say, yeah, actually, I'm game for a hug right now. Or if they're like, no, I'm not really feeling it. And then your reaction models and empowers them to use their voice even more. So if you ask them if they want a hug and then they say, I don't really want a hug, and then you get mad at them, what does that tell them? That they don't get to be honest, right? And we want them to be honest. We want them to find their voice. And we want to teach them to listen to other people's voice when they say yes or no. So I think consent is huge, and I just hope you guys lean into that. So remember, boundaries are time, talk, and touch. And you guys are going to have an awesome job, do an awesome job just walking this out with your kids.